I don't know how familiar any of you are with the horrors that live in the Appalachian mountains. I'm not talking your run-of-the-mill horrors like you see in the movies. Believe it or not, there aren't that many banjo-playing psychopath families living in the mountains. At least, not around here. I guess there's always a chance of running into them, but I haven't, and I don't know anyone who has. Besides, I'm talking about the things you're told only live in stories. Things that could never exist in the real world. Some of those things, well, they're real, and they found a home right here in the wilds of Appalachia. I've seen what some would refer to as ghosts or spirits. That's pretty common around here. Usually, if you don't try to interact and you don't do anything to piss them off, the spirits don't bother people. Do I pretend to understand what they are and what their purpose is? No, I absolutely do not. Anybody who claims that knowledge is probably playing you for a fool and taking your money to boot. But there are other things that are roaming around these ancient mountains. Things that I didn't believe existed until I had no other choice. I mean, if you come face to face with a mythical creature and find out it's flesh and blood, you have to believe in everything, don't you? I don't know how I feel about my newfound knowledge. I know that I'm scared and more than a little confused, but that's to be expected whenever you encounter something so strange, so terrifying that it's life-altering. My whole belief system is on the verge of crumbling to dust, and I'm too damn old to be building a new one. Not to mention, I don't know where to begin rebuilding a brand new shiny system of belief. Now, 2 years ago, I inherited close to 70 acres with 2 houses, 4 big barns, and 8 storage sheds. The big house had the county electricity hooked up. There was no house phone, no internet, and the water came from the 2 wells on the hill, above and behind the house. The smaller house was off-grid, which in this case means only that it didn't have county electric hooked up like the big house did. My uncle married a Russian woman who had come here to search of the American dream. Anastasia Ivanova was her name. She and Malcolm hit it off right away, and there's nothing he wouldn't do for her. An aneurysm took her when she was 56, and Uncle Mal nearly lost his mind with grief. So did his son. My uncle would have passed that property to his son, but Thomas died less than 2 years after his mother had passed. He was 30, successful, and he never had any children. The only person left in the family to pass was to me. So you're sitting there saying, "Oh yeah, it sounds horrible, Joe. I wish I had that kind of bad luck." But believe me when I tell you that I wish more than anything that I had never seen that place. When I took possession of it, I was nervous and excited. I'd never owned any property. I still owed 15 years of payments on my 1-acre plot at the edge of town and the 5-room house sitting on top of it. So, 70 acres? Yeah, you bet I was excited. I felt like I had just won the lottery. By the time I unlocked the front door and stepped into Uncle Mal's old place, I had already worked out how much I was going to charge someone to rent my place at the edge of town, and how long it would take to start making money from my new property. I was going to start marking trees for cutting the next day. I would sell the lumber and make enough money to pay and have a road put through the woods at the back of the main house. That new road would cut the driving time from town in half, and during the winter, when the roads were icy, I wouldn't have to drive on the steep side. It never occurred to me that Uncle Mal had never put a road in there for a reason. I just kind of figured he never thought of it, and I was proud of myself for my foresight. It would be easier to get the crops out of the holler into the farmer's market. I could set up a small Christmas tree farm and people could cut their own trees. And then there was the pumpkin patch for the kids in the fall, A Halloween maze through a cornfield. Man, I had so many plans for the place, for my future. I pushed the front door open and the smell of dank dead air rushed around me, trailing what seemed to be 5 years of dust behind it. The humid air coated my bare skin a fraction of a second before the dust did. Before I stepped over the threshold, I saw markings etched in the wood of the doorframe. It looked almost like letters, but not really. I'd never seen anything like it, and since there were only 3 of the small, weird symbols, I didn't think much more about it. If not for the perfect slant of the sun, I would never have seen them at all that day. First thing I did inside was open up all the windows on the first floor to get the old air moving out. There were a lot of windows in those 6 rooms, and the air immediately began to freshen and be replaced by the sweet, clean smell of the woods. The place hadn't been sitting empty for years, but it sure smelled that way to start with. Uncle Mal only died 6 months before. I saw the framed photos on the mantel in the living room. Some were from the 1800s, family photos that went back to when photography was new and most people didn't have the money to have their pictures taken. Then there were 5 portraits that were even older. One of these was a portrait of Anastasia's family, several generations back. Her family had been wealthy back then, and the portrait showcased their wealth. They were dressed in the finest fashions and lived in a mansion with expensive furnishings. She had talked about them often. She would talk about how it was her parents who had lost a fortune and made it impossible for her to remain in her beloved homeland. I looked from that old painting to the modest furnishings in the room. Had she ever been happy living back in the woods with Uncle Mal, I wondered? Nothing in the house was lavish and rich. They weren't poor, not even close, but everything in the house was, well, modest. Like they didn't want to spend their money on frivolous things, maybe. Or perhaps they didn't want to feel like they were flaunting their good fortune. What I didn't mention was that Uncle Mal left me a considerable amount of money along with the property. There was enough that I didn't need to do anything for money, and I mean that sincerely. I could have left the place as it was and simply lived the rest of my life on that money. Hell, I probably could have lived decently on the interest it earned. I was used to pinching pennies until they screamed just to scrape by from one paycheck to the next. I kept the money part to myself. As I gave the faded photos one last look, a pang of guilt stabbed at me. Sitting on the end of the mantel was a small photo from when I was a kid. I'd been about 4 in the photo, but I remembered that day. Mom and Dad had been alive then. We were all smiling out in the front yard. In the background, the remnants of a large picnic were visible. I had a half-eaten apple in one pudgy hand, and a smile that said I was having a blast. I picked up the picture and carried it with me into the kitchen where there was more light through the windows. Anastasia's smile was small and seemed forced. Something about the look in her eyes made me wonder what had been wrong that day. Mom's smile was tight. Had there been some tension between them that I, as a small child, had not noticed? I put the picture on the dining room table and looked out toward where we had that picnic that day. Why hadn't I been back to visit Uncle Mal and Aunt Anastasia more? Why had I only been back a handful of times since that day? We were only about 30 minutes away back then, and after Mom and Dad were gone, I still never lived more than 30 minutes away, but Uncle Mal might as well lived up on the moon for all the visiting that I did. The shame settled on my shoulders like a weight. Took a good while, but I finally got moving again. What good was it to stand there regretting not being a better nephew? The road obviously went both ways, right? Mal and Anastasia could have come off that mountain and visited me too, but they never did. Not once that I could recall. I checked the pantry situation. There was so much canned soup and vegetables that I wouldn't have to buy any for months. As I stepped out of the pantry, I noticed the same symbols had been carved into the frame of the doorway. They, like the ones on the front door, had been done a long time ago. The edges of the cuts had been worn smooth by time, and I knew that some people around here were into hoodoo, witchcraft, and even voodoo, but not my family. We'd been raised to not mess with that sort of thing. It could invite an evil that would wreak havoc on one's life. After a moment of pondering the thought, I chuckled humorously. The sudden bark of sound in the otherwise silent house startled me, and I shut up as the very house seemed to groan low in its bones. It was ironic that I feared the evil that might destroy my life, my family, my happiness. Hadn't God already seen fit to do that? I walked out of the pantry, and the pall of my family's slow eradication over the years weighed heavy on my mind. Being in that house should not have evoked such a glum feeling. I should have been happy. I wanted to be happy. Damn those stupid marks and whoever had carved them. Upstairs, I stripped the bed, flipped the mattress, and remade it with my own fresh sheets. The other bedroom up there had been turned into something else. I don't know if you'd call it an office, a study, or a well-appointed storage room. An old rolled-up desk sat beside one of the windows. After getting settled in as well as I could for the day, I sat at that desk and went through the papers I found in there. Some of the information was interesting, but most was just boring everyday things like bills, work orders, and invoices. Mal had been diligent about keeping all his paperwork in order. Taxes, bills, receipts, and the like. One thing I found interesting was how little they spent at the grocery store. There were unopened envelopes addressed to Anastasia, and with them a return address in Russia. 3 of them, all with the same handwriting on them. The postal dates were well before she died, and yet she had never opened them, and it wasn't my place to do so either. Don't guess it would have made any difference one way or the other if I had, but I slid them back into place and left them alone. In a shallow drawer, I found Mal and Anastasia's marriage certificate. They had been married in New York City. That shocked me. I never thought of Uncle Mal being in the big city. He was as country as they get. He hated even going to Johnson City for a day, and that's nothing like New York. Underneath all that was Anastasia's death certificate. I picked it up and a chill ran over the back of my neck. I felt like I was being watched in that instant. Maybe it was because I was going through someone else's personal things. I turned in the chair so that my back wasn't to the open doorway to ease that feeling a bit. The cause of death was listed as exsanguination. I ain't gonna lie, I had to look up the word to be sure of its meaning, and I was stunned. Why had everyone lied about how Anastasia had died? The last time I checked, aneurysms didn't cause blood loss, and the death wouldn't be listed as suspicious. The more papers I read, the more I learned that shook me to the core. There had been a 3-year investigation into Anastasia's death. A cop had even disappeared on the property and was found months later rotting in the bottom of a rocky crevasse. Uncle Mal was cleared of the charges in Anastasia's death at the end of the 3-year investigation. I don't think they suspected him in the cop's death. And then it hit me that Thomas had also died on the property. He fell from the loft of one of the barns, and he had died before the investigation into his mother's death was ever finalized. That meant he had to have known the truth about how she died. He knew an aneurysm wouldn't take her out. Now I began to wonder if Uncle Mal had something to do with both deaths. Not generous of me, I know, but I couldn't help it. His wife died, and he and Thomas perpetuated the lie to me and my parents, possibly to her family back in Russia as well. Or did they even know? I took out the unopened letters and put them in the drawer with the other papers, and I closed it. Eventually I would open them up. They deserved to know what happened to her. I mean, didn't they? Even if they were on the outs, they were still her family. Now I tried to put all that out of my mind. I had work to get done if I wanted to get the property set up the way I wanted by the next year. With about 6 months of decent weather in which to work toward that goal, I couldn't spare the time to dwell on things that were long past. There was nothing there I could change anyway. My future, though, now there was something I could change. Hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks as I vetted and finally hired a logging crew. I drove stakes and ran twine to mark crop fields while the crew set up and started work in the woods. Looking back, there were warning signs. Little things at first, like the feeling of being watched. It was like an unseen threat lurked just outside my field of vision. It didn't matter if I was in the house or if I was outside. The only time it wasn't present was if I left the property. Then I started missing things. Again, little things that would have easily been misplaced or lost. The set of skeleton keys to the other house, a receipt for the first load of logs sold to the mill, my favorite coffee cup, and a single sock. Though perplexing, I didn't have time to go all goosey over the stuff. There was just too much work afoot to be wasting time looking for the stuff. I could find the keys and check out the other house any time. It wasn't going anywhere. And what's a sock and a coffee cup, even if it was my favorite? They were replaceable. That's what they were. That happened over about 2 weeks. That's when the bigger, harder to ignore stuff started happening, and I had to take notice. The logging crew left one day. Right in the middle of the day. I thought the noise and rumblings had stopped because they were taking lunch, when 3 in the afternoon rolled around, and I still didn't hear any sounds of equipment. I walked up the hill and through the woods to see what was wrong. They were just gone. All 5 men and the equipment. The only things they left behind were a couple of grease rags, some felled trees that hadn't been delimbed, and tracks from their vehicles. I went to the paved road to get a cell signal and called Joe to find out why he and the crew were gone and when they'd be back. He told me they weren't coming back, that they were done, and I would have to find someone else to finish the job. We haggled, but I won't bore you with the details. All I could get from him was that they had seen something that spooked them so badly that they had left and wouldn't come back. I even offered to pay them double just to get the job done, but it did no good. Now that roadway wasn't even a quarter of the way cleared. There was barely 300 feet cleared from the paved road to where the work had stopped. The trees were dense, and it wasn't an easy undertaking to clear them. But I saw nothing that should have spooked anyone. I did feel as if I was being watched by someone or something with malicious intent, though I passed it off because I was so pissed and frustrated. It was too late to do much more that day, so I detoured and went to the other smaller house. It was a quaint single-level cabin made from rough-hewn wood from the surrounding property. The front door was open, and the interior lay in deep shadow already. I stopped and looked back the way I had come. I couldn't get a signal for the cell at either of the houses, which is typical around here. The keys for the cabin had been gone, and it looked like I had to figure out why. Had there been something in the cabin that I didn't know about? Perhaps something valuable. I stood listening for a couple of minutes and heard no movement from inside. The feeling of being watched had intensified, but I saw nothing in the surrounding woods. Maybe the place had been burgled, and the culprit had already fled. I didn't know how long the door had been standing open, and maybe since the keys went missing, which meant the burglar could have been long gone off the mountain, and I was standing there acting like a sissy for no reason. With the first step onto the porch, dread settled around me like an unwelcome too tight embrace, and I paused. If someone was still inside, I'd nothing to defend myself. I turned to leave, and something clattered on the wooden floor behind me. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that I landed 4 feet in front of the porch. I barely contained the sudden panic enough to glance over my shoulder to see what had come out of the cabin after me. Now, I don't know what I expected to see, but the walking stick laying at an angle in front of the door wasn't it. I stopped in mid-stride and turned to fully assess the stick and the doorway again. Had the stick been propped outside the door? Had my weight shifted a floorboard and caused it to topple? So I yelled, "Hello? Someone in there?" Silence answered. "If there's someone in there, come out. Just leave off. Ain't no harm, no foul, but you can't stay here." Silence and the prickle of goose flesh as a chill breeze encircled me were the only replies. I couldn't live back there if I was going to be scared out of my mind every time something like that happened. I had to buck up and at least go inside and make sure there was no one in there, and look for the lost keys so I could lock the place up. I picked up the walking stick when I stepped onto the porch again. Apparently the thing had been standing there, unused for a long time. A fine coating of moss had sprouted around the top third of it, and a thick netting of spider webs covered the rest. The gossamer strands billowed out to the side as I pulled the stick closer. Underneath the moss and webs were more of the markings like I had seen on the door frames at the house. Pushing the door wider, I called out again, not expecting to get a reply. And there was none. I stepped inside and saw that all the curtains had been pulled. They had been open when I first checked the place after first moving up there. Someone had definitely been there. I opened the curtains and I checked the rooms. There was nothing to even suggest someone had been there, although I knew better. I took the time to investigate the place better. Everything was coated with a layer of dust. Everything except for the little wooden box on the table by the front door. It was covered in those carved symbols. Some of them looked like ruins, but most seemed to be the doodlings of a child. I picked up the box and carried it to the porch where there was more light. It wouldn't have mattered how much light I put on the markings, they still made no sense to me. I lifted the hinged lid. Inside, there was a lock of black hair tied at one end with 2 long blades of grass. Strands of ivy had mingled into the lock of hair. At the bottom of the box was a knife that looked like an amateur had forged it. There were dark stains on the wooden hilt. Someone had written on the lid of the box in Russian. It made about as much sense to me as the symbols. The only difference was that I could translate the Russian using an app on my cell phone. The symbols? Probably not, but it wouldn't hurt to try. I closed the cabin door, but I didn't lock it. I still didn't know where the keys were, and I didn't want to accidentally lock myself out. On my porch, I propped up the walking stick next to the door. In the house, I put the box and its contents on the kitchen table while I made dinner. It was an intriguing find, but I would have to go off property to get signal on my phone, and I didn't want to do that night. It was also getting dark. I was tired, and it had been a shit day. I wanted to figure out how to get another crew to finish the road. The box wasn't going anywhere, and I could deal with it after I took care of other business. I didn't know much about witchcraft and the like, but the carved symbols and the stuff in that box sure made me think I didn't know my aunt and uncle as well as I thought I did. While my burger sizzled in the skillet, I decided to look into the box again, sure that there had to be some sort of explanation that didn't include witchcraft. The box felt warm to the touch, I'm talking unnaturally warm, like I had been sitting in the sunlight all day. And when my fingers touched the lid, the carved symbols began to glow. It was a soft, greenish glow so faint it might have been mist, say, out in the direct sunlight. I jerked my hand away and the glow disappeared. I tried again, and again the symbols glowed. The longer I left my hand on the lid, the brighter the glow became. Had it been glowing when I carried it down from the cabin? Had it lit up like that when I touched it the first time? I didn't think so, but I questioned myself. Maybe I simply hadn't noticed it because it was so faint, and I was as nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof when I'd been looking through the place. Now, before I lost my nerve, I yanked the lid open. The inside was filled with a low, dim amber light that emanated from the writing. The light was fading slowly, so was daylight outside. It was a terrible idea to start poking around with that box at sunset. A smarter person would have tossed it outside, or they would have taken it back to the cabin and left it. But I never claimed to be a smart person. Nosy? Yes. Curious? To a fault? Yes again. I mean, if the box had been there for years, as I suspected, it couldn't have been that dangerous. Now I reason that there are phosphorescent minerals and such in caves, and there are caves aplenty around here, and maybe that's what was emitting the glow. But why would it react to my touch, though? That I didn't understand. And with a new theory in place, I was eager to keep investigating, so I took out the lock of hair and laid it on the table. The knife seemed to vibrate as the writing lit up brighter. Keeping one hand on the outside of the box, I watched in fascination as the inside brightened, and the knife vibrated so intensely that it levitated. At first, it was about half a centimeter off the floor of the box. My heart raced, and I laughed. Hell, it was amazing, and I was hooked. No phosphorescent mineral could do that. Surely no. The knife slowly rose higher until it was level with the top edge of the container. I curled the fingers of my other hand around the handle, bracing myself for anything. At least, I thought I was bracing for anything. The moment the knife was securely in my grasp, the glow from the letters and symbols died out, as if someone had turned off a light switch, and the box was cold again. The knife in my hand, however, turned hot, almost hot enough to burn, and I couldn't uncurl my fingers from around it. My laughter and fascination turned to horror as I realized I couldn't let go of the thing. My forearm cramped, and my fingers tightened around the damn thing even harder. I stepped back from the table and tried to sling the knife away, but it wasn't going anywhere. I might as well have been trying to throw away my own hand, but the logical part of my brain told me to keep trying. And I did. I even tried pulling the blade with my other hand. It felt like the hilt had melded with the skin of my palm. I screamed and thrashed the blade against the counter. The vibrations from each strike reverberated through the small bones of my hand and wrist. The last time I struck that counter, I saw movement through the window at the top of the door. Someone was there. I screamed for them to help me. I didn't much care who it was. If it was a burglar meaning to rob me blind, well, if they would have helped me free my hand from that knife, I would have helped them load up all my shit and called it even. I nearly ran to the door, meaning to throw it open, but what I saw stopped me, stopped my screaming, and it left me frozen in place. There was no panic left, only the dreadful knowledge that I had either gone completely batshit crazy, or I was going to die in some unimaginable way at the hands of the thing on my porch. There were 3 loud thuds as the creature pounded the end of the walking stick on the floorboards. It flicked its head towards the door, and its moss and ivy tangled beard rippled as the door popped open. I shuffled back a few steps until I hit the table. I gripped my right wrist with my left hand, wondering if I could use the knife as a weapon against the thing entering my house, as if it was normal everyday business, and that it should be there, that it should exist in the very reality that I exist in our world. The man-like figure ducked its head and bent at the waist to be able to step inside, and once inside, he remained bent. He was too tall to stand upright. With 9-foot ceilings, there was no man or woman alive who was that tall, but that thing was. I tried to scream as I pedaled my feet against that floor, but all that came out was a whimper. The table scooted a few feet, hit the cabinets, and struck solid. The creature seemed to be made up of the forest itself. The body had been formed from green saplings and willow tendrils that were twisted together. The legs and arms seemed to be grapevine and sawbriars. The hair was prickly grass that stuck straight up in a thick mass on top of its head, and the eyeballs weren't eyeballs. They were fat grubs. What I had mistaken as the constantly moving whites of blind eyes were actually 2 continually writhing grubs. I wanted to pass out or just die from a heart attack, but even death didn't want to step in between us, I guess. As I wide-eyed that abomination, worms wiggled out where should have been a mouth, and they took the form of lips that moved into a wry smile. The movement broke the mold of the thin moss over his face, and small chunks fell to the floor. He poked my shoulder with the walking stick and said something that I couldn't understand. The voice was like wind through dry leaves. He spoke again, and the grubs bulged as he pushed his face closer to mine. I shook my head. At least, I think I did. I still didn't understand whatever he said. Before I could blink, his smile turned into a frown, and sawbriars bit into my right wrist and hand. I found just enough breath to scream. The scream broke my paralysis, and I started fighting. Well, I was throwing punches and kicking like a jackhammer, but it didn't seem to do much. But while I was doing that, I started screaming threats. They were empty because I had no clue how to hurt the thing, or if it could be hurt. He turned, keeping hold of my wrist, and walked outside, dragging me with him. My screams echoed and bounced all over the mountains, and I hoped someone would hear and come to help. When he stood upright, he was between 12 and 15 feet tall. I'm 5'10", and he was more than twice my height. After 5 minutes of being pulled along like a disobedient child having a temper tantrum, I felt the briars nicking tendons and bones. If I wanted the hand to remain intact, I had to try another way to escape, but there was nothing. He dragged me past the cabin and into the woods. The moon's cold, uncaring gaze lit the way. Finally, we stopped in a tiny clearing among a stand of ancient oaks, and the creature shoved my hand to the ground, forcing me to all fours. He said the same thing as he had in the house, only it was louder, more forceful. I screamed that I didn't understand him, and some of the briar spikes eased up off of my bones. It wasn't enough that I could have even hoped to pull away, but it was something. I screamed that I didn't understand him again, and he stared at me, his grubs sinking into his skull, and the worms he used for lips twisting around each other. Then he turned away and said something to the woods. Something sighed. It was a distinctly female sigh. And I looked around. Who the hell would be answering the hellspawn that had hold of me? If she was in a league with him, I didn't want to meet her. And so you can imagine my surprise when Aunt Anastasia appeared from the deep shadows of the forest. Or maybe you can't imagine. I couldn't move or think or breathe. As she walked toward me, the state of her body became more apparent with each gliding step. Bugs raced over her rotting flesh. Her bones peeked through desiccated sinew and muscle fiber, and her smile wasn't a smile. Her teeth and jawbones were exposed. "Toby Marsh, do you know me?" Her voice was still recognizable even though it was turning into the sound of a mountain stream. I nodded. Tears rolled down my face. Terrified, horrified, no words can accurately describe what I was feeling. "The land calls," she said, pointing to the knife and holding out her own arm to show me the tender underside of her forearm. She drew her fingernail from the inside of her elbow to the wrist. I shook my head. I wasn't sure what she meant, but I wasn't going to cut my own arm. She moved closer, leaned her head to my ear, and whispered. She whispered of beauty beyond imagination, power unlike in any of the universe, and how it could all be mine, how it should be mine. She told me that we were the only two humans to be accepted by the Leshy, and that if I only obeyed the rules of the bargain, I would be richer and more powerful than I ever dreamed. I told her that I didn't want to die. She assured me that I would live well past my life expectancy. All I had to do was to make a blood oath to the creature she called the Leshy, who was the embodiment of the forest. Just a few drops of my blood would tie the Leshy to the property and vice versa. He would protect it and me, and would make sure the land was fruitful and I was prosperous in any endeavor that included the property. I shook my head again, and the briars bit into my arm deeper and harder. The Leshy twisted my arm slightly, and the thorns ripped through my skin, leaving jagged, bleeding gashes. I yelled and begged for him to stop, but that slow twist and increasing pressure continued until I agreed that I would do whatever they wanted if he would just let me go. The briars instantly withdrew from my arm, and I gasped with relief. The knife was still melted to my palm, and I held it out. "Get it off me," I said to the animated cadaver of my late aunt. She said the knife was forged from the land, and I had to draw my own blood with the blade for the pact to be cast. I let the blood from my injuries drip freely onto the ground. There, it's done. I gave the blood. But I had to be freely sacrificed, and by my own hand with that knife. She said it was the only way I'd be able to let go of the knife. If I continued to ponder the situation in different ways, I might be able to wheedle my way out of the promise I'd made. I was likely to die. In desperation, I drew the blade down my other arm. The knife fell to the ground along with my blood, and I shot to my feet, pressing the wound to my shirt. Anastasia began fading into the darkness, and as she went, she told me the rules of the pact. Every moon I had to return and offer a small amount of blood in the same manner. I had to preserve the forest and all the wildlife to the best of my ability, which meant never finishing the road, and I was never to miss a new moon ritual, or the pact was broken. I've never been back to the property during the new moon, the full moon, or the whatever moon. The creature had a taste of my blood, but he isn't tied to the property anymore. I'm pretty sure he could go wherever the hell he wants to, or at least however far he could track me like a bloodhound. I keep on the move just in case he wants to find me. Tonight, just after sunset, I heard the wind howling through dried leaves in the distance. I could have sworn there were indecipherable words in the sound. Sometimes that happens, though. Could be paranoia, but I can never be certain. I'll never be certain of anything again as long as I live.